Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
You ever have one of those moments when the world seems to tilt just a little? Not enough to knock you down, but just enough to let you know that something sacred has been broken. That was me, sitting on the edge of my bed on a rainy Thursday in March, holding a manila envelope with the lawyer's seal on it, realizing that my brother, my own blood, had stolen $80,000 from me and had the nerve to call it a mistake. It wasn't the money, not really. Hell, I've scraped by on teacher's pay for 22 years and learned how to stretch a can of soup into 2 dinners. What burned deeper than any zero missing from my bank balance was the way he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Let it go, it's family." Like that excuse had the power to wash away theft, betrayal, and every lie he's ever told since we were kids, growing up in a 2-bedroom house with paper-thin walls and no locks on the doors. My name's Heather, I'm 48, divorced, no kids, no pets, and no patience left for people who smile when they stab you. I've always been the quiet one in the family, the helper, the responsible one, the one who sent our mother birthday flowers every year, without fail, even when she forgot mine. The one who stayed by Dad's side while he was dying, feeding him applesauce and turning him so he wouldn't get bed sores. And Jack? Jack was the golden boy who never did a damn thing but somehow ended up with all the applause. He floated through life with charm like a grease coating that kept the dirt from sticking. Every time he got caught in something, sneaking beer from Dad's truck, crashing a car without insurance, blowing through his rent money, it was always someone else's fault. And everyone bought it. When Dad passed last summer, the will was simple, half to me, half to Jack. No strings, no complications. It was just the 2 of us left, so it should have been clean. Dad had already prepaid for the funeral, left the house to be sold with the proceeds split evenly, and made sure all his accounts were clearly labeled. But within a month, something didn't sit right. The bank hadn't contacted me about the wire transfer that was supposed to land in my savings. I waited, gave it time. Told myself maybe there was a delay. Maybe there was paperwork still floating somewhere in probate limbo. But then I saw the boat, a shiny white 23-foot Bayliner, parked in Jack's driveway like a trophy. He named it Easy Money. I remember laughing when I saw it, not because it was funny, but because the irony was so loud it echoed. That same week, I got a call from the estate attorney. Turns out the money had been transferred weeks ago, but not into my account. It had gone directly to Jack's, under what the bank had listed as a signed authorization. Only I never signed anything. And when I confronted him, he just tilted his head like a dog hearing a new sound and said, "Oh, that, huh? I guess the bank messed something up. Whatever, let it go, Heather. It's family." I didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't throw anything, although every nerve in my body was on fire. I looked him straight in the eye, nodded, and said, "Okay." That one word was enough. Because I've learned over the years that silence cuts deeper than screaming, and planning is a better weapon than rage. And Jack, for all his charm, never saw me coming. But before I go further, let me tell you something about people like Jack. They don't think, they react. They've been told they're special for so long, they start to believe it's some kind of divine truth. They start to believe that people like me, quiet, responsible, predictable, will always roll over, apologize for bleeding when we're cut. And when we don't, when we stand up and say no more, that's when their hands start to shake. I went home that night and pulled out everything I had. The will, my dad's notes, old emails, bank letters. I started a folder, labeled it Jack's Reckoning, and tucked it into the drawer where I used to keep my wedding photos. The irony wasn't lost on me. Both were chapters of betrayal I had survived. Both would teach me something about how much pain a person can carry before deciding to do something about it. Over the next few weeks, I stayed quiet. Said nothing to our mother, nothing to our cousins, nothing in the family group chat where Jack kept posting photos of his new lake lifestyle like he was some damn Instagram influencer. I watched, listened, collected. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to wait. Because revenge, real revenge, It's not about fireworks or screaming matches or breaking dishes in the kitchen. It's about time. It's about knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. And it's about choosing the moment that'll leave the deepest scar. And I knew exactly when that moment would be. Our Aunt Eleanor was dying. Cancer, stage 4, and stubborn as ever. She was old school, wore lipstick to chemo, and never let anyone push her wheelchair. She always said, "Funerals bring out the truth in people." She wasn't wrong. Hers would bring out mine. So I let Jack float along, grinning through every family dinner, while I sat across the table and smiled like everything was fine. I let him think he'd gotten away with it. I even laughed at his jokes, because sometimes the best thing you can do to a liar is let them believe they're safe, until they're not. There's a peculiar kind of ache that doesn't scream or sting or demand your attention all at once. It simmers low and steady, like a pilot light left on, under a pot that eventually boils over, long after you've forgotten you were even cooking. That's how it felt waking up each morning and remembering, even before the coffee had brewed or the blinds had been pulled up, that my own brother had stolen from me, smiled about it, and then shrugged it off like he'd borrowed a damn sweater. The ache wasn't about the money itself, although let's not pretend $80,000 is just pocket change. It was the fact that someone I shared a bloodline with could take something so intentional, so clear-cut and documented, and reduce it to an oops with no shame, no effort to fix it. And worst of all, no consequences. I didn't talk about it, not to friends, not to coworkers, not even to the therapist I saw once a month, mostly out of habit, more than necessity. The only person I told was a lawyer named Cynthia Klein, whose office smelled like old books, and whose handshake told me she'd handled her share of dirty family business. I met her 2 weeks after Jack dropped that careless bomb in my lap, the one where he smiled and said, "Let it go, it's family," as if those words were some sacred cloak that made crime invisible. Cynthia didn't blink. She took one look at the paperwork I handed over, copies of the will, account statements, email chains from the estate executor, and said, flat as a stone, he knew exactly what he was doing. I remember staring at her across the desk, the early afternoon sun catching the edge of her glasses as she flipped through pages, and asking, almost timidly, do people actually win these cases? I mean, legally it's cut and dry, but do they really win? She looked up, met my eyes, and said something I'll never forget. Winning depends on what you want to feel afterward, satisfaction or peace. You rarely get both. For the next few weeks, I played my part like it was second nature. I showed up to family gatherings, smiled at birthday parties, commented on photos in the family chat with the same tone I'd always used. Jack was as arrogant as ever, sliding into conversations like a snake in dress shoes, bragging about interest rates and investment portfolios like he was auditioning for a commercial. It was at a 4th of July barbecue that the real fire started to smolder in me, not because of anything he said directly, but because of what he didn't say. He stood there, drink in hand, talking about the boat like it was a prize he'd earned, telling Uncle Roger how he was finally getting some payoff for all those risky decisions he'd made. And just like always, the family nodded, laughed, and praised him, while I stood there with a paper plate full of overcooked burgers, biting the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started putting together a digital trail that would be airtight. Screenshots, emails, bank transfers, notarized signatures, or in this case, forged ones, and every piece of evidence that showed, line by line, that Jack had deliberately and knowingly moved my inheritance into his own account. It wasn't sloppy, it wasn't an accident. It was fraud. And he did it because he believed I wouldn't fight back. Because history had taught him I'd always choose quiet over conflict. I thought about all the times in childhood when I took the blame for things he did. The broken window, the missing $20 bill, the dent in Dad's truck. Jack was always just one step ahead. Just charming enough to dodge accountability and just manipulative enough to make you feel guilty for being angry at him. Our parents bought into it because it was easier. It was easier to believe their son was just careless than to admit he was calculated. The turning point came when Cynthia called and said, "I found something." She'd gotten a copy of the transfer authorization Jack had submitted to the bank. It wasn't just a miscommunication. He'd actually forged my signature, using a scanned version from an old shared lease we'd signed for Dad's storage unit 5 years ago. He'd uploaded it, submitted it with the estate paperwork, and moved the money 2 weeks before I even knew the estate had settled. That discovery shifted something permanent inside me. It wasn't just betrayal now, it was criminal. I remember walking into my mother's house the following Sunday for brunch, the smell of cinnamon rolls and burnt coffee hanging in the air like a memory of better days. Jack was already there, laughing too loudly, buttering toast like it was some kind of sport. I sat down across from him, kept my voice light, and asked, "So, how's the boat treating you?" He smirked. "You know, I should have bought it sooner. Life's short." And our mother, oblivious as always, chimed in. "You two really should try to get along. Dad would hate seeing you this way." The hypocrisy nearly knocked the air out of me, but I smiled and nodded, because I wasn't going to fight in a kitchen with peeling wallpaper and mismatched mugs. That wasn't where this battle would be won. After brunch, I slipped into the guest room where Dad used to sleep, opened the bottom drawer of the old pine dresser, and found exactly what I was looking for: his final notebook, a leather-bound relic where he scribbled everything from grocery lists to private thoughts. I flipped through until I found a single page marked with a corner folded down. In shaky handwriting, he'd written, "If Jack finds a way to screw Heather over, she'll figure it out. But just in case, I've left the originals with the lawyer. No matter what he says, don't let him talk you down. He's been charming his way out of trouble since he could speak. And you've been bailing him out since you were 12. Enough." My hands shook a little reading it. Not with rage, but with a strange sort of relief. Like I wasn't crazy, like I wasn't alone. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't show anyone the page, but when I got home, I added it to the folder, Jack's Reckoning, and emailed Cynthia a scan. She called within the hour. "You ready to do this the loud way?" I laughed, long and slow, and said, "Not yet. Not until the perfect moment." Because if you're going to take down someone who's lived their whole life like a stage show, you wait until the lights are brightest, the audience is largest, and the curtain is about to fall. And I already knew exactly where that would be. Aunt Eleanor's funeral, the one place where silence wouldn't protect him. There's something uniquely unsettling about the kind of silence that blankets a funeral. Thick, heavy, and full of the things people don't say aloud. The glances that carry more weight than any eulogy ever could. And the subtle dance between grief and performance that always plays out when families gather to mourn. When I arrived at Aunt Eleanor's service, dressed in a black wool coat I hadn't worn since Dad's funeral 3 years prior, I felt that silence wrap around me like a shroud, not entirely unwelcome, but undeniably suffocating, like it had been waiting for me specifically, as if it knew this wasn't just a farewell to a stubborn old woman who baked cookies. No one ever really liked and handed out unsolicited advice like Candy. It was something more, something calculated, something I had been preparing for in silence, in shadows, and with a precision that Jack would never see coming because men like him never believe that the quiet ones know how to sharpen knives. The church was already half full when I walked in, the air tinged with the usual blend of floral arrangements and old wood pews soaked in decades of whispered prayers and unspoken family resentment. I took my seat in the third row, not too close to be noticed, but close enough to see everything. Jack, of course, was at the front, wearing a charcoal suit a little too slim for his frame, with his hair slicked back like he thought he was starring in a courtroom drama. His wife, Tessa, clung to his arm like a barnacle on a sinking ship. And if she had any idea what was waiting for him, she didn't show it. Then again, maybe she did. Maybe that's why she never once looked my way, choosing instead to keep her eyes trained on the casket like it might offer some kind of salvation. The service was short, which was just as well, because the longer people talk about the dead, the more they start to lie. The priest mumbled something about Eleanor's generosity and unwavering family values, and I nearly laughed out loud, because the woman I remembered locked her front door during trick-or-treat, and told me once, with a straight face, that therapy was just an excuse to talk about yourself for an hour. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what I had tucked neatly into my purse, a single white envelope, unassuming on the outside but packed with the kind of weight that didn't need to shout to be heard. After the burial, the family shuffled into the church hall for coffee and dry sandwiches, performing the rituals of grief more out of obligation than genuine loss. I stayed on the edges, sipping my lukewarm coffee, watching Jack as he laughed with cousins he barely spoke to, his hand gesturing animatedly as he told some story that had no business being told at a funeral. He was in his element, basking in the soft glow of family attention, completely unaware that the stage he was so comfortable performing on was about to collapse beneath him. When the moment felt right, when the room had just enough people in it, when the volume had risen to a pleasant hum, when Jack was smack in the center of a small crowd, I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and stood in front of him. For a half second, he didn't register me. His smile didn't falter. Then his eyes met mine, and I saw it, the flicker of recognition, followed by something colder, something that told me he'd been hoping I wouldn't come at all. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope, and handed it to him with both hands. It was the kind of gesture that could be mistaken for something kind, if you weren't paying attention. But Jack knew better. He took it with the same fingers that had once handed me a melted ice cream cone. On a hot summer day when we were kids, and for a second, I wondered if he remembered that day too, before either of us had learned how to hurt each other the way only siblings can. He opened it, and as his eyes scanned the contents, pages of legal documentation, copies of the forged signature, bank statements, and the court summons with his full name printed in bold black ink, his face went slack. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and then his hands, steady just moments before, began to tremble in a way that was almost imperceptible. But I saw it. I wanted him to know that I saw it, because that tiny shake was the first crack in the mask he'd worn his entire life. "Are you seriously doing this here?" he whispered, his voice low and venomous, barely audible over the hum of conversation around us. I leaned in close enough that he could smell the peppermint on my breath, and I said just loud enough for his wife and at least 3 others to hear, "You stole from me, and now everyone is going to see who you really are." He stood there frozen, the papers in his hands suddenly too heavy to hold, and the noise in the room began to dim, not because anyone knew what was going on yet, but because energy shifts when something real is happening. People feel it, even if they don't understand it. Tessa reached for his arm, confused, murmuring his name, but Jack didn't answer. He just kept looking down at those pages, like they might rearrange themselves into something more favorable if he stared hard enough. I didn't linger. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a slow metronome counting down the end of his illusion. I didn't stop to gauge reactions, didn't wait for whispers or confrontation. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't need applause. It just needs to be undeniable. By the time I reached the exit, I could feel the heat of eyes on my back. Some confused, some judgmental, but a few, just a few, felt like understanding. Like maybe someone in that room had been wronged once, had stayed silent, had swallowed their rage for the sake of keeping peace at family dinners, and was now watching me do the thing they never could. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like a baptism, sharp and clean, and I breathed in deep for the first time in what felt like years. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel shame. I felt ready, because Jack had taken what wasn't his, hidden behind the shield of family, and thought I wouldn't do anything about it. But now the game had changed, and I had just made the first move in front of the entire board. When people talk about family, they like to paint this picture of unshakable unity, of blood being thicker than betrayal, of forgiveness being handed out like casseroles at a potluck, and of grievances dissolving with time simply because you happen to share a last name or a collection of holiday memories and childhood scoldings. But what they don't tell you, what no one likes to admit even in whispers, is that family doesn't break all at once like a glass dropped on tile. It cracks slowly, one hairline fracture at a time, and by the time you notice, it's already too late to fix it without cutting your hands wide open. The aftermath of the funeral was not an explosion. It was a quiet disintegration, a slow burning undoing of the fragile web that had held our family together for decades, out of obligation more than affection. It began with the silences, the texts left unread, the invitations that stopped coming, the sideways glances at the grocery store when I ran into second cousins who used to greet me with hugs and now barely made eye contact as they mumbled half-hearted condolences. No one said it outright, of course. That's not how people like us operate. We don't argue openly. We withdraw, we murmur, we choose sides with subtlety, like casting invisible ballots that end up dividing a house without a single raised voice. Jack, unsurprisingly, wasted no time in painting his version of the story, a tired narrative spun with the usual ingredients: misunderstanding, miscommunication, and his favorite fallback: she's always been dramatic. I know he made his rounds, called every aunt and cousin and neighbor he could think of, softening the edges of his fraud into something more digestible, something that made me look like the unhinged sister, the bitter old maid with a grudge and nothing better to do than stir up chaos at a funeral. I didn't counter his calls. I didn't flood the family chat with documents or screenshots or links to court filings. I didn't defend myself to anyone, because the truth, when held patiently and quietly, becomes louder than any lie shouted into a phone line. But even so, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt, that it didn't twist something inside me to watch people I'd once trusted pull away like I was contagious. My own mother, who once told me I was her rock, called me the night after the funeral, her voice a strange blend of disappointment and resignation. "Heather," she said after a long pause, "I just don't understand why you had to do that in front of everyone. Couldn't you have handled this privately?" Jack's humiliated. I sat there listening to the words tumble out of her mouth like pieces of someone else's puzzle, realizing in that moment that the woman who raised me still hadn't learned the difference between peace and silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and ask her why Jack's humiliation mattered more than my dignity. But instead I just said, "He wasn't humiliated when he took the money." And she, with a sigh thick enough to crush bone, whispered, "He's your brother, Heather. Sometimes we have to let things go, for family." I hung up without responding. I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I was afraid of what I might say if I started talking. Afraid that once I began naming every time Jack had stolen, lied, manipulated, or coasted on the backs of other people's effort, I wouldn't be able to stop. And what would be the point? They'd already decided who they were going to believe. It was easier for them to preserve the golden boy myth than to face the rotted truth underneath it. What they didn't know, what Jack didn't know, was that the court date had already been set. The envelope I handed him at the funeral wasn't just a scare tactic or some petty gesture. It was the beginning of a process that had been meticulously crafted with the help of a team who'd seen enough cases like mine to know exactly how to build something airtight. Cynthia had worked around the clock, digging into every digital corner Jack had tried to hide his tracks in. And what she found wasn't just proof of theft, it was proof of intent. Emails where he used my name to authorize transfers. Voicemails left on the estate lawyer's machine in which he implied I had already agreed to let him manage the disbursement. He hadn't just taken the money, he had choreographed an entire lie and expected everyone to dance along with it. The week after the funeral, I drove 2 hours out to the bank, where my father had kept his safety deposit box, one of the few things Jack hadn't touched, likely because he thought it only contained old papers and the kind of personal junk no one wants after someone dies. I had the key, the ID, and my father's notarized list of items stored inside. When the clerk handed me the contents, I found more than I expected: letters, old photos, a small stack of savings bonds, and most important of all, a sealed envelope labeled in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, "If Jack screws up again." Inside was a letter, written not in anger, but in a strange kind of exhausted love. He wrote about Jack's habits, his patterns, the way he always made messes and expected others to clean them up. And he wrote about me, about how he knew I would try to forgive, again, and how I shouldn't. The words weren't cruel, they were resigned. You've always been the one who stayed behind, he wrote. But this time, don't. He needs to learn what it costs to use people like tools, and you need to see what it feels like not to be one. I read that letter 3 times, alone in my car, the radio off, the parking lot empty, and I cried, not just for what had happened, but for how long it had taken me to realize that forgiveness without accountability is just surrender in disguise. When I walked into court the following Tuesday, I did so without fanfare. Jack was there already, standing outside the hearing room in the same suit he wore to the funeral. Only this time, the confident mask had slipped just enough to reveal the panic underneath. He saw me, straightened his tie, and when I passed him, he said, "We don't have to do this, you know. It's not too late to stop." I turned to him, calm and clear, and said, "It was too late the moment you decided I wouldn't fight back." Then I opened the door and walked inside, ready to end the lie, ready to let the truth stand, even if it meant standing alone. Because at that point, the family had already split. The damage had already been done, and the only thing left was to finish what he started. Only this time, on my terms. There are moments in life that stretch far beyond the boundaries of time as we know it. Moments that, despite lasting only minutes in the eyes of the clock, unfold within you like slow-motion reels of every decision, every hesitation, every quiet act of defiance that led you to that exact place. Sitting across from Jack in that sterile, echoing courtroom, with fluorescent lights humming overhead, and a judge whose expression held no room for sentiment or excuses, I felt the weight of everything we had both carried, both concealed, both inflicted. The truth, when presented not as a story but as evidence, cold, clear, and irreversible, has a way of silencing even the most skillful liars, and for the first time in our lives, Jack had nothing clever to say, no charming pivot, no exaggerated shrug to disarm the reality he had crafted with the arrogance of someone who had never once faced the consequences of his own choices. The case itself, from a legal standpoint, was uncomplicated. Fraudulent use of identity, unauthorized transfer of estate funds, intentional misrepresentation of inheritance disbursement, all confirmed by signatures that didn't match, emails that contradicted one another, and timelines that left no room for misunderstanding. But beneath the legal jargon and procedural motions, the deeper conflict was harder to define, harder to place neatly into a file or a ruling. It was about power, about the long shadow cast by a lifetime of imbalance, and about the small, imperceptible ways someone like Jack had chipped away at other people's sense of worth until there was almost nothing left to stand on. What I had brought into that courtroom wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. The judge listened attentively as Cynthia laid out the facts with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from knowing you've built something unassailable. She didn't dramatize. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The document spoke louder than any emotion ever could. And as the pages turned, one after the other, I watched Jack's posture shrink slightly, his arms folding in, his jaw clenching just enough to reveal the truth he wouldn't admit. He thought he'd get away with it, and now he was realizing that he wouldn't. When his lawyer stood to respond, some local guy with slicked back hair and a folder full of distractions, I listened without flinching, even as they tried to spin the narrative toward confusion, toward clerical error, toward some murky, accidental misstep that had spiraled out of control. But the judge was unmoved. He leaned forward only once to ask Jack directly, "Did you or did you not authorize the transfer of your sister's inheritance into your account without her explicit consent?" Jack hesitated, just for a second, but in that hesitation everything unraveled. And when he finally said, "I didn't think she'd care," the courtroom went still in a way that felt almost sacred. The judgment was delivered without ceremony, full repayment of the inheritance plus legal fees, with a deadline that left Jack visibly shaken. The gavel came down like a door being shut, not loud, but final. And as people began to shuffle out of the room, I remained seated, staring not at Jack, but at the empty table where the truth had finally been laid bare. There was no cheer, no applause, no cinematic swell of music to signify a triumph. There was only stillness, and beneath it, a quiet shift inside me that felt less like victory and more like release. In the weeks that followed, the family fractures deepened, hardened, and turned into something unspoken and permanent. There were no invitations that year for Thanksgiving, no polite reminders of birthdays, no attempts at reconciliation. My mother sent me a single message, 2 lines, no punctuation. "I hope you're happy, he's ruined." I didn't respond because I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't happy, not in the way she meant. I was simply free, free from the roles we'd been forced to play, from the false peace we were expected to maintain, from the lie that blood obligates you to suffer silently. And yet even freedom has its price. Holidays became lonelier. Friends I thought would understand kept their distance, uncomfortable with the idea that I had drawn a line so publicly. Even Cynthia, who had fought beside me so fiercely, warned me that there would be fallout I couldn't control. "People want clean stories," she said, "and this one doesn't have a clean ending." She was right. Because justice, while satisfying, is rarely neat. It leaves questions behind. Questions about who we become when we finally say, "enough," and whether the loss of peace is too steep a toll to pay for truth. Months later, long after the courtroom lights had dimmed and the dust had settled, I received a plain white envelope in the mail. No return address, no name, just my own written in familiar handwriting. In it, there was a personal check for $10 and a single note scribbled on the hotel stationery. "You won. Are you happy now?" I stared at it for longer than I'd like to admit. Not because I didn't know how to respond, but because part of me, the part that still remembered sharing bunk beds, splitting Halloween candy, whispering secrets under the blanket when we were too old to be doing so, wanted to believe that somewhere beneath all the lies and theft and arrogance, there was still a brother. But the woman I had become, the one who had spent months rebuilding her dignity piece by piece, knew better. I didn't cash the check. I didn't call or write back. Instead, I took the note, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the fireplace, watching the flames curl around the words and turn them to ash. It wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't even closure. It was simply a choice. To stop carrying something that was never mine to hold in the first place. And as the embers burned, I thought about all the stories we're told as children, about family, about forgiveness, about the noble virtue of keeping the peace. And I wondered how many of those stories were written by people who'd never been asked to sacrifice themselves in order to keep others comfortable. I wondered how many women like me had smiled through betrayal, silenced their instincts, and swallowed their truth because someone told them that it's just how families are. And I realized, perhaps too late, that sometimes the cost of keeping peace is far greater than the cost of losing it. So no, I wasn't happy. But I was finally at peace. And that, for the first time in my life, was enough.